Imagine the world's greatest basketball legend, Michael Jordan, the name synonymous with victory, ambition, and unmatched greatness, stripping away his fame, his wealth, and everything that defines him. What would happen if the man who could dominate any court suddenly walked through the doors of a prestigious Beverly Hills bank, not as the billionaire superstar, but as someone dressed in tattered clothes, carrying nothing but a crumpled $20 bill? Michael Jordan, the man who soared through life with an unwavering drive, now wants to know how the world sees him when his fame is invisible, when his fortune means nothing. With a hidden camera and a quiet determination, he steps into the heart of luxury, testing not just the policies of a high-end bank, but the very humanity of those who think they have it all. What happens next will surprise you. Stay tuned, because you won't believe what Michael Jordan discovers when the masks of privilege and power are peeled away. The quiet start. The sun cast its warm, golden rays over the streets of Beverly Hills, illuminating the world where the affluent flourished in their luxury. Expensive cars, Bentleys, Ferraris, and Lamborghinis glided past immaculate storefronts, their owners unaware of the lives outside their bubble. Beverly Hills was a city that celebrated success adorned in opulence, where wealth and privilege spoke louder than words. It was a place where everyone seemed to know their place and their worth. But on this day, something was different. Amid the polished marble facades and the hum of high society, a figure walked down the street that didn't belong. His shoes were worn, scuffed by the roughness of the world. His jeans were frayed at the edges, faded from years of wear. A long, tattered jacket hung loosely on his thin frame, the sleeves fraying at the cuffs. A scruffy beard clung to his face, and a baseball cap pulled low shielded his eyes from the world. He was the picture of someone overlooked, someone invisible to society's gaze. Michael Jordan, yes, the man who had once soared above the competition, who had inspired millions with his athleticism, determination, and success, was now that figure. Dressed as a man with no name, no wealth, and no status, he walked through a world where he was now just one more face in the crowd. His disguise wasn't just about blending in. It was about shedding the expectations that had followed him his entire life. For a man who had spent decades in the spotlight, adored by millions and admired for his unmatched talent, this experiment was his chance to see what it felt like to be unseen. What was it like to be dismissed before anyone knew who you were? How did society treat those who had nothing to offer, at least not in material wealth? Michael had won championships, secured endorsements, built an empire, but what did that truly mean when it came to the value of a person? This was not about testing a bank's policies or its services. No, Michael was seeking something deeper, something far more personal. He was testing the human condition. How would people see him now? Would they notice his humanity, or would they judge him solely based on what they saw on the outside? He stood outside First Summit Bank, the grand institution looming before him. Its gleaming glass doors reflected the shimmering sun, creating a sense of wonder and perhaps unreachable perfection. Michael hesitated for a moment. Inside these walls were people who lived lives that were far removed from his own, but were they any different now when the title Michael Jordan meant nothing? Would the judgment still be the same? Taking a deep breath, he pushed the doors open and stepped inside. His footsteps echoed on the marble floors, the sound hollow and distant. His heart pounded with a mix of anticipation and vulnerability, as if this simple test could reveal the raw truth of human interaction. For once, he wasn't Michael Jordan, the champion, the icon. He was just another man walking through the door. And as the doors closed behind him, the world within the bank paused, just for a second. Everyone in the room turned, their eyes gliding over him like a passing shadow, unable to discern who he truly was. Would this be the moment when everything changed? Or would this moment simply reveal the harsh truths about the world Michael had come to see with new eyes, inside the opulence? As Michael stepped further into the bank, he felt the weight of the world around him shift. The silence was almost suffocating, a hushed reverence that hung in the air as though the very architecture of the building demanded respect. Polished marble floors reflected the soft glow of golden chandeliers above, casting shadows that seemed to dance around the room. The air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee, the kind that promised a comfortable wealth that only a few could enjoy. Inside, the patrons sat with ease, their presence commanding the space. They sipped their coffee in plush leather chairs, conversed in hushed tones, exchanged polite nods and warm smiles. Their clothes, perfectly tailored suits, designer heels, and gleaming watches, spoke volumes of their place in the world. They were the people who belonged here. They were the people who mattered. But Michael, dressed in frayed jeans, worn-out shoes, and a jacket that had seen better days, was nothing like them. His very presence was a stark contrast to the polished luxury that enveloped the room. The moment he walked in, the air seemed to grow heavier. Conversations slowed, eyes darted his way, and a few patrons leaned in to whisper behind their hands. The whispers, though soft, were loud enough to sting. His clothes, his appearance, his very being screamed outsider, a stark reminder of everything he no longer was. The man who had once ruled basketball courts, who had filled stadiums with roaring fans, who had been worshipped by millions. Here, in this world of wealth and exclusivity, he was nothing. To the people around him, he was simply another homeless man, unworthy of attention. They saw the outer shell, the worn edges of his clothes, the stubble on his face. They didn't see the story beneath, the years of sacrifice, the dedication, or the struggle to rise above the circumstances life had handed him. They didn't know that beneath the surface was a man who had once known power like few others. They didn't see Michael Jordan, the icon, the legend. They saw a man who didn't fit into their world, and they didn't want to. He walked to the reception desk, where Marilyn, the receptionist, looked at him with thinly veiled disdain. Her perfectly styled hair, her immaculate makeup, and the cold, indifferent expression she wore were everything that this place stood for. Exclusivity, privilege, a society where wealth was not just admired but worshipped. Her gaze scanned him up and down, taking in his tattered appearance as though she had already decided his worth before he even spoke. Her voice, though polite, carried an air of superiority. "Can I help you?" she asked, her words clipped, like she was speaking to a child. "I'd like to open a basic checking account," Michael replied, his voice calm, steady, unwavering in the face of her obvious judgment. The question seemed to throw Marilyn off balance for a moment. She blinked, then quickly masked her surprise with a practiced smile. "Our minimum deposit is $500, she said, enunciating each word with precision, her tone dripping with condescension. "Do you have the necessary funds with you today?" Michael reached into his pocket, pulling out the crumpled $20 bill. He smoothed it out on the counter, the faded currency standing in stark contrast to the gleaming marble and polished counters. "I have this," he said quietly, without hesitation. His gaze unwavering as he met her eyes. For a moment, Marilyn's expression faltered, and Michael caught the briefest flicker of disdain in her eyes. Then, like a mask slipping back into place, her smile returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm afraid that won't be enough," she said with a soft laugh that held more contempt than humor. "Perhaps you should try a different institution, one more suited to your circumstances." It wasn't the words that stung, but the way they were delivered. It was the ease with which she dismissed him, as if his humanity didn't matter, as if his worth was based solely on his outward appearance, on the money he could bring to the table. In that moment, Michael understood something deeply unsettling about the world he had walked into. The walls of privilege, the gates of exclusivity, were harder to breach than he had imagined. He glanced around the room, noting the smirks from other patrons who, with barely concealed amusement, whispered to each other. He could feel their judgment, the quiet disapproval in the air, and for a brief second he felt it, the sharp sting of vulnerability, the feeling of being truly powerless in a world where appearances dictated everything. But even in the face of rejection, Michael remained composed. The experiment had begun, and though the results were predictable, the emotions it stirred were undeniable. This was not about the $20 or the checking account. It was about something far more profound. It was about seeing the world through the eyes of those who lived in the margins, those who were cast aside, ignored, and dismissed. As Marilyn turned her attention elsewhere, Michael's gaze shifted to the young woman sitting nearby. Her name tag read Clara, and unlike the others, her expression wasn't one of judgment. She seemed conflicted, her eyes lingering on him with something he hadn't seen before, a flicker of empathy or maybe discomfort. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to stir something inside him. In that moment, he realized that sometimes, all it took was one person to look past the exterior and see the humanity beneath. And in that fleeting exchange, he felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that perhaps, just maybe, the world wasn't as cold and indifferent as it seemed. A turning point. The weight of rejection lingered in the air long after Michael stepped away from the reception desk. The opulence of the bank seemed to fade as he stood there, clutching the crumpled $20 bill in his hand. Outside, the sun still blazed, casting long shadows on the marble floors, but inside everything felt colder. The laughter of the staff, the whispers of the patrons, each one cut deeper than he expected. The world he had once dominated, the world where his name had commanded respect, had vanished in an instant. Now he was just another faceless person, cast aside without a second thought. It wasn't the coldness of the reception that stung the most. It was the ease with which he had been discarded, the seamless way in which he had become invisible, a mere nuisance to the people whose lives seemed so distant from his own. In that brief moment, Michael was no longer Michael Jordan, the global icon. He was a man with nothing but his humanity. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. It wasn't the mocking gaze of Marilyn, nor the whispered comments of the patrons, but rather the gaze of the young woman at the desk. Clara. At first he had only noticed her out of the corner of his eye. She was sitting at her desk, her focus on something other than him, but as he moved closer, their eyes met, briefly, almost imperceptibly. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, and in that fleeting instant, Michael saw something different in her eyes. It wasn't judgment, it wasn't disdain, it wasn't the dismissal he had come to expect. No, in Clara's eyes, Michael saw something far more profound. Empathy. Her gaze wasn't filled with the same coldness as the others. It wasn't masked by superiority or a sense of entitlement. It was a gaze that acknowledged his humanity, something the rest of the room seemed determined to ignore. It wasn't pity, nor was it a fleeting gesture. It was something deeper. It was the understanding of a shared human experience, a recognition that the world could sometimes be cruel, even to the greatest among us. For the first time since he had entered the bank, Michael felt a glimmer of something other than rejection. He felt seen, not for his fame or his accomplishments, but simply for who he was in that moment. A man, a human being, and that feeling, however brief, was something he hadn't realized he had been searching for all along. But just as quickly as it had come, the moment was over. The security guard approached, his presence firm but polite. "Sir," he said, his voice gentle but unyielding, "if you're not conducting business that meets the bank's policies, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Michael nodded, his grip tightening on the crumpled $20 bill. The words stung, but they didn't surprise him. He had expected this. The walls of privilege, he now understood, were harder to scale than he had anticipated. He had come to test the system, to see if the world would see him differently if he were stripped of his title, his wealth, his influence. And in some ways he had gotten his answer. But as he walked toward the door, his thoughts didn't linger on the rejection. They lingered on Clara. Her eyes, her hesitation. There was something about her, a quiet defiance in the way she had looked at him. It was as if she, too, had seen the world he had been trying to understand. And in that brief moment of connection, Michael felt something stir within him. What if Clara was different? What if instead of following the unspoken rules of this world, she had the courage to challenge them, to see beyond appearances and embrace the very humanity that had been dismissed by the system? Michael didn't know the answers, but as he stepped outside into the glaring sunlight, the weight of his experiment grew heavier. The privilege he had once taken for granted felt distant, as if it no longer mattered. This wasn't just about testing the bank's policies. It was about testing something deeper, something more intrinsic, the ability to see each other as equals, regardless of wealth, status, or circumstance. And as he sat on the park bench, watching the world rush by, he couldn't help but wonder if Clara might be the key to unlocking that elusive connection he had been searching for. The decision. Clara had spent the night replaying everything in her mind. The image of Michael Jordan, dressed in tattered clothes, holding a crumpled $20 bill, had been seared into her memory. She couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at her throughout the night. It wasn't just that she had been passive, standing by while he was rejected. It was that she had let her own fear and the cold, unyielding culture of the bank dictate her actions. She hadn't stood up for him. She hadn't been brave enough to break the rules and challenge the unfairness of it all. And in doing so, she had been complicit. As the hours ticked by that night, Clara wrestled with her conscience. The bank, the place she had come to work with the intention of making a difference, had shown her something dark. She had joined the institution believing it would offer her a platform to help people, to manage their finances and guide them toward better futures. But what she had witnessed in just one day had shattered that idealistic vision. She had seen how easily people were dismissed, how their worth was measured by the money they could bring, the appearance they maintained, the societal position they held. The next morning, as she walked into the bank, Clara could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her. The bright morning sunlight outside did little to alleviate the heaviness in her heart. She passed the familiar marble floors, the high-end furniture, the soft music that played as if to mask the tension in the air. The bank, with all its grandeur, felt hollow to her now. It was a place where appearances mattered more than people, where wealth had more value than humanity, and Clara had become part of that system, part of a culture that prided itself on its exclusivity, its privilege, its disconnect from the very struggles it claimed to serve. Clara sat down at her desk and stared at the screen before her, but her thoughts were miles away. She couldn't focus on the numbers, the files, the emails. Instead, her mind kept drifting to Michael, his calm demeanor in the face of rejection, his quiet dignity. She had seen the other patrons laugh at him, sneer at him, as if his worth was somehow determined by the ragged clothes he wore. She had heard the condescending tone in Marilyn's voice, the dismissive way she had told Michael to try a different institution. But what Clara couldn't forget was the look in his eyes when he had left. The look that said he wasn't just a man who had been treated unfairly, but a man who had been dismissed by the very system that claimed to help others. She couldn't get his face out of her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about the way he had stood there, not with anger or bitterness, but with a kind of quiet acceptance, the kind of acceptance that came when you've been pushed to the edge so many times, when society has taught you that you are nothing, when you've learned to simply take whatever scraps are thrown your way and keep moving forward. But Michael had not given up. He had walked in, asked for help, and been turned away, and in doing so he had exposed a flaw in the system that she had been too blinded to see. Her mind raced. She couldn't undo what had already been done, but she could take action now. She could be the person who stood up, who did the right thing, even if it meant going against the rules. This was her chance to make it right. Not for the bank, not for the policies, but for Michael, for all the people who had ever been told they weren't good enough, who had been turned away by systems that didn't value their worth. Clara knew the consequences of what she was about to do. She had heard the whispers, seen the disapproving glances from her colleagues when they spoke about clients like Michael. They would see what she was about to do as a betrayal. She would likely face reprimands, and if she pushed too hard, she might lose her job. But Clara realized something important in that moment. Sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks. It means standing up for someone who cannot stand up for themselves, even when it seems like the whole world is against you. She made up her mind. This wasn't just about Michael. This was about all the people who had been discarded by society. All the invisible ones who were forgotten the moment they didn't fit the mold. This was her chance to break free from the machine of exclusivity and privilege. She couldn't change the world in one go, but she could change one moment, one action, one life. A new beginning. Clara's heart raced as she walked back into the bank with Michael beside her. The familiar, marble-clad interior seemed almost surreal in the quiet of the moment. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, the reality of what she was about to do settling over her like a storm cloud. She had crossed the point of no return. There was no going back. The comfortable routine of her life, the comfortable beliefs she had always clung to, now felt fragile, as if it would shatter at any moment under the weight of her decisions. She was about to challenge the very fabric of the institution she had once believed in. She glanced at Michael, who walked beside her in his tattered clothes, his demeanor unshaken. To the outside world, he was nothing more than a homeless man, but Clara knew better. He was more than that. Michael had become a symbol to her, a symbol of everything that was wrong with a world that discarded people based on their circumstances. A symbol of all those who had been denied opportunities simply because they didn't fit into society's narrow definition of worth. And now, she had the chance to make things right, at least in one small corner of the world. The bank, once a place of power and prestige, now seemed cold and distant. The staff moved with their usual air of indifference, paying little attention to Michael as he followed Clara through the ornate doors. The polished floors reflected their footsteps, but to the others they were invisible. Clara's chest tightened as she approached her desk. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, could sense the silent judgment in the air, but she couldn't care anymore, not when a human life, a human being, was at stake. "Clara!" Marilyn's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. Clara froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Who's that?" Marilyn's question was laced with disbelief, her tone dripping with condescension. Clara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath, her hand trembling slightly as she logged into the system. She couldn't ignore the pressure mounting from behind her, but she couldn't let it sway her either. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of the world pushing back on her, but she was determined to stand firm. "This is Michael," Clara said quietly, her voice steady despite the nerves that twisted in her gut. "I'm helping him open a basic checking account." She could feel the incredulity radiating from Marilyn as she glanced toward Michael, her lips curling in an almost imperceptible sneer. Clara knew what was coming. She had heard the whispers, the jokes behind closed doors, the ridicule of those who didn't fit the mold, but she couldn't let them stop her. Not now. Not when she had the chance to make a difference. "The minimum deposit is $500, Marilyn said, her voice dripping with superiority. "You know that. We can't make exceptions for everyone who walks in off the street." Clara felt her heart hammering in her chest. But she didn't flinch. She had made her choice. She was going to do this, no matter the consequences. "I'm aware of that," Clara replied, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. "But I'm waiving the deposit requirement. I'm using my employee privileges to help him get started." There was a moment of stunned silence before Marilyn spoke again, her voice tinged with disbelief. "You're willing to risk your job for this?" she asked, her words harsh and dismissive. Clara turned to face her, her gaze unyielding. Yes, I am," she said, her voice firm. "Everyone deserves a chance, Marilyn, even if they don't fit your idea of who belongs here. Especially then." The room seemed to freeze, the weight of Clara's words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. She could feel the eyes of the other staff members on her now, their judgment sharp and unforgiving. But she didn't care. She was done being afraid, done pretending that the rules of this institution were more important than human dignity. Michael remained quiet, standing behind Clara with a calm presence that seemed to hold the room in place. He had been cast aside, rejected, humiliated, but here, in this moment, he wasn't just a man in tattered clothes. He was a person deserving of respect, of kindness, of humanity. Clara hit the final key on the keyboard, completing the transaction. She had done it. She had opened an account for Michael Jordan, despite the bank's policies, despite the judgment from her colleagues, despite everything. As she handed Michael the paperwork, she felt a weight lift from her chest. It wasn't just about the account. It was about the simple act of doing what was right. For once, Clara had acted with her heart, not her fear. She had chosen empathy over indifference, kindness over judgment. Michael looked at her, his expression soft but grateful. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "You didn't have to do this." Clara smiled, her eyes meeting his with a depth of understanding. "Yes, I did," she replied softly. "We all do. We just have to remember to look past the surface and see people for who they really are." As Michael left the bank, Clara stood at her desk, her hands still trembling slightly, but her heart swelling with pride. The world hadn't changed in an instant, but in that moment she had. She had chosen to be different, to see the humanity in others, regardless of their appearance or their circumstances, to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult, even when it meant risking everything. And as the doors closed behind Michael, Clara couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of something bigger, something better. She had learned that one small act of kindness could shatter the walls of privilege and indifference. That sometimes the greatest victories weren't the ones you achieved for yourself, but the ones you achieved for someone else. As her shift wore on, Clara waited. She kept an eye on the park outside the window, hoping to see Michael's familiar figure sitting on the bench. Hours passed, but he didn't appear. Just as the doubt began to creep into her mind, she saw him. There, across the street, sitting quietly on the same bench, his presence was a reminder that he was not just a part of the experiment. He was a real person, with real needs, real hopes, and real dignity. Clara knew what she had to do. During her lunch break, she grabbed her bag and hurried across the street, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached him, Michael looked up from his quiet observation of the world around him. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips as he recognized her. "I thought you might come back," he said, his voice calm, yet full of curiosity. Clara took a deep breath before speaking. "I wanted to apologize again," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "It wasn't right the way you were treated yesterday." Michael nodded slowly, his eyes searching hers. "It's okay," he said, his tone gentle. "It wasn't your fault." Clara shook her head, her conviction growing. "No, it's not okay. No one should be treated that way. I've been thinking about it all night, and I want to help you. I want to help you open that account." Michael's eyebrows raised in surprise, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. His eyes spoke volumes. "I don't know if I can do much," Clara continued, "but I can at least get you started. I can bypass the deposit requirement and open an account for you." "You're willing to risk your job for me?" Michael asked, his voice low but filled with awe. "I'm willing to risk my job for what's right," Clara replied, her voice steady. "Everyone deserves a chance, no matter what they look like or where they come from." Michael smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "I admire that," he said softly. "You're the kind of person this world needs." Clara stood there, looking at him, her decision now made. Let's do this. As they walked back into the bank together, Clara felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. This wasn't just about opening an account. It was about making a stand, about saying no to the judgments of the world, no to the systems that divide us, and yes to something greater: humanity, empathy, and the recognition that every person, no matter their background, deserves to be seen. The world might not change overnight, but Clara had taken the first step, and that, she knew, was enough. The message conveyed in this story is one of empathy, courage, and standing up for what's right, even in the face of societal norms and expectations. It emphasizes the power of human connection and the importance of seeing beyond appearances to recognize the humanity in everyone, regardless of their circumstance. At its core, this story is about the transformative power of kindness, the willingness to break free from the confines of privilege, and the idea that every individual deserves a chance, no matter where they come from or how they look. Clara's decision to help Michael, despite the rules and risks, is a powerful reminder that we all have the capacity to make a difference in someone's life with a simple act of compassion. If you were moved by Clara's decision and Michael's story, I encourage you to reflect on your own experiences with empathy and kindness. Sometimes all it takes is one person to make a change. Let's be that person for others. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay updated with more impactful stories like this. Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on the importance of empathy and kindness in today's world. Your feedback means a lot to us and helps us continue creating content that touches hearts and inspires change. Join the conversation, and remember, we all have the power to make a difference.